Magnus Carlsen has been the greatest chess player in the world for a decade now. However, even someone of his skill is susceptible to making mistakes every now and then. This begs the question, what are Magnus Carlsen's biggest blunders throughout his impressive career? Let's get right into it. The best place to start is the 2022 World Rapid Tournament, where Magnus Carlsen faces off against Vladislav Artemiev. It starts with Vladislav going pawn d4. Magnus responds with knight to f6, turning the start into the well-known Indian game. Due to Magnus being familiar with such a start, it could be a factor as to what leads to this big blunder. After a few moves, Magnus decides to go on the attack, bringing his bishop out to b4, checking Vladislav's king. Vladislav blocks with his own bishop in response. Magnus decides to trade those bishops early in the game. After Magnus castles his king, Vladislav thinks carefully and does the same. Magnus then makes the interesting decision to capture d4 with his knight, hoping to cause a trade. However, this chain of events would lead to his downfall. Vladislav captures with his queen, to which Magnus responds by attacking Vladislav with both his rooks in order to make the queen retreat. Magnus decides to bring his bishop out in an attempt to push towards an endgame, which he excels at. However, in this particular game, fate had a different plan. He launches an attack on the right side of the board, seizing an opportunity to trade rooks. This is where everything takes a turn for the worse. Vladislav moves his rook to d1, but in a shocking turn of events, Magnus plays knight e4, which is a huge mistake. Although he tries to maintain composure, Vladislav realizes the blunder. Magnus is forced into an awful trade, losing an entire piece. It's evident that Magnus is not happy with his decision. This move ends up costing him the game, as Vladislav capitalizes on his mistake and secures a victory. How does this compare to when Magnus lost in 19 moves though? Magnus Carlsen was playing against the greatest female chess player ever, Judith Polgar. While the match was expected to be legendary, Magnus lost in 19 moves after an uncharacteristic blunder. Judith starts the game with pawn e4, to which Magnus responds with pawn c5. The reason for this move was to try and fight for the central 4 squares, which happens to be the most dominant spots on the board. Judith decides to move her knight to f3, which causes Magnus to respond with his pawn to c6. Judith moves her next pawn to d4, which sets the stage for Magnus's blunder later on. A few plays of developing pieces later, and Magnus eventually brings his knight to c6. This creates a more intense Taimanov variation of the Sicilian defense. After Judith moves her bishop to e3, Magnus moves his queen to c7. Judith moves her own queen to d2 in response. A few more moves are made and both players are relatively even. Magnus pushes his bishop to e7 while Judith castles. This makes her king very secure. After both of them move their pawns forward, a few pieces are exchanged. Soon after, Magnus moves his bishop to b7. This threatens the pawn on e5 and the security of the middle of the board. Judith pushes her pawn forward to e5, putting Magnus's knight in danger. This forces Magnus to take the g4 pawn with the knight. This ultimately is what leads to his soon-to-come blunder. Judith goes rook g1, pushing the knight to the edge of the board. A few more moves later, and Judith is threatening Magnus's bishop. This is where the blunder happens. With the time ticking down, Magnus moves his rook to c8, and Judith moves her bishop to b6. This blunder has resulted in Magnus being trapped. He has no choice but to sacrifice his queen. The blunder proves to be too much for him to overcome, as he soon resigns against the legendary female chess player. 19 moves is nothing compared to 8, however. Magnus Carlsen faced an opponent with a rating of 2,900 in a bullet game. This is where both players have only 1 minute on their clocks. His opponent opens with pawn e4, and Magnus responds with pawn c6, employing the Caro-Kann defense. Magnus is extremely confident as he swiftly sets up a bunch of pre-moves. This confidence is what would lead to his quick defeat. Knowing the simplicity of the main lines of the Caro-Kann defense, the opponent sneakily tries to checkmate on h7. He ends up barricading the square with his bishop and queen. Magnus falls victim to this unexpected blow. In frustration, Magnus rips his shirt. While this was embarrassing, what about the time Magnus broke the rules? One of his biggest blunders comes from simply breaking the rules accidentally in a blitz game. Magnus opens with the white pieces, to which he goes to pawn e4. His opponent responds with pawn c5. This is well known as the Sicilian defense. Magnus goes with pawn d4, which is quickly captured by his opponent's pawn. Magnus uses his knight to take that pawn, capturing the center. Each player spends time developing pieces until the game starts to heat up. Magnus pushes his queen to d2, while his opponent goes knight f6. This isn't a great move, which plays to the favor of Magnus. Both players trade pieces, which gives Magnus control of the center of the board. As time runs out on both clocks, Magnus captures b4 with his knight, while his opponent recaptures with his pawn. Magnus captures b4 again with his rook, gaining a strong advantage. After a few trades and shuffles, Magnus makes a critical mistake. He accidentally moves his king to d4 instead of c4, resulting in a double move. His opponent calls him out on the mistake and Magnus is forced to resign. This blunder, along with the others, are memorable moments in the amazing career of Magnus Carlsen. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more in-depth chess videos like this one. See you next time.